Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. And we are in Genesis here, as you will see in a second. And in the Garden of Eden, or almost out of the Garden of Eden, as it turns out to be. So we've had in last time we had God confronted Adam, God confronted Eve, and now God confronts the serpent. Okay. Vayomer Hashem Elohim, and the Lord God said, El hanachash, to the serpent, Ki asita zot, because you have done this, arur ata mikol habeima, you are cursed from all the cattle, mikol chayat hasadeh, and from all the beasts of the field, more than all the beasts of the field. Al gechoncha telech, you shall go upon your belly, va'afar tochal, and you shall consume dust, kol yamei chayecha, all the days of your life. So first of all, we notice that when it came to Adam and Eve, God asks, well, what happened? What did you do? Etc. And with the serpent, God doesn't do that. God just tells him straight out, this is the consequences of your behavior. Okay. Ki asita zot, because you have done this. Mikan, and from this passage we learn, she'en mahapchin bizchuto shel meisit, that you don't show any bias towards someone who seduces either to idolatry or otherwise. Meisit is someone who seduces. She'ilu she'alo, because had God said to the snake, Lama asita zot, why did you do this? Haya lo lahashiv, the snake could have responded, would have had an argument. Divrei harav, the words of the master, v'divrei hatalmid, and the words of the student, divrei mi shomim, who should you be listening to? And since God, in this case, is the master, and God had said, do not eat from the tree, and the snake, in a sense, was the student, Eve had no right to listen to him. He's saying, I'm sorry, there's no reason that Eve or Adam did what they did. They should have paid attention to the fact that God, you were the one who commanded them. And of course, there's a lot to think about in terms of the metaphoric meaning of what is going on here. You know, it's certainly a classic interpretation to understand the serpent as a phallic symbol. And the question is this actually a story about human beings following their base instincts? And the fact that we should know better, that here, at least certainly through the Torah, but pretty much in most, if not all cultures, there's certain taboos about sexual behavior. And do we listen to those taboos? Or do we listen to our baser instincts? That's maybe what's being said here. And it's hard to interpret this literally, okay, that it's really talking about a historical event. It just, first of all, the language itself doesn't seem to suggest it. But the issue then becomes, so how do we interpret this? What is the interpretation of what's being said here? And what is the Torah trying to teach us here? So going on a little bit further, Mikol HaBehema, above all the cattle, or from all the cattle, umikol chayat hazeh, and from all the beasts of the field. So the fact that it says mikol, from all, the from is called the partitive article, and it means as, at least in the way it's interpreted within Jewish interpretation, classical interpretation, is it means not necessarily all, but it means some of all. So im behema. So there's a classic question here, because im behema nitkalel, if in fact the snake was cursed more than the beasts of the field, mechaya lo kol shechein, wouldn't it have made sense that if he was cursed more than the beasts of the field, well, then certainly he would have been cursed. The serpent would have been cursed more than the beasts, And in other words, why does the Torah use this first little section? Okay, had it just said from the beasts of the field, would we have understood? Let me think. Okay, no, it doesn't need. It appears. I'm trying to make sure I understand. So mechayat lo kol shechem means all the more so it would be cursed from the beasts of the field. So that seems to imply, from what I can tell, that the beasts of the field are cursed more than the domesticated animals. So that's why it didn't need to use this phrase, the beasts of the field. Had it just said more than the domesticated animals, we would have known already that the snake would be cursed more than the beasts of the field. So these words seem unnecessary. He'emidu rabotenu. So Rashi tells us that our sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud, right, were able to figure out midrash zeh, this particular interpretation, b'Masechet Bechorot, in the tractate Bechorot. He's telling us a reference. It turns out to be page 8. L'lamed, to teach, sheyemei iburo shel nachash, that the days of gestation of a serpent, sheva shanim, are 7 years. 7 years. And I took a look at the reference, at the discussion, and essentially there's a whole quite lengthy passage where they go into the gestation of the different animals, and they compare it to the amount of time it takes certain trees, fruit trees, for example, to mature, how long it takes their fruits to mature. And they compare each fruit tree with a different class of animals, etc. And there are certain conclusions that they draw as to the length of time of gestation for these various animals. And of course, it's there that they figure out 7 years for a snake. Now, I don't know if a snake actually does take 7 years to gestate. It does sound like an awfully long time. But at any rate, if it isn't in fact the case, then we are then challenged to understand what are the rabbis trying to teach us here. So I do not have a solution for this at this point. It's one of those issues which I have to sort of tuck in the back of my mind and say, well, maybe someday I'll understand exactly what they're saying. And of course, this has happened from time to time, where I've had an insight in studying and said, that's what it means. That's what it's referring to. Al gachoncha telech, you shall go upon your stomach. And this is interesting. It says raglaim hayulo. The snake, the serpent, actually had feet at one time, v'nit katsatsu, and they were cut off. And I remember years and years ago seeing some X-rays of snakes, and with an indication that they actually did have at one point legs, and that they, in the course of the years, they no longer had them. So that is interesting. That bears out with, in fact, some evidence to that. But again, I do think that there are meanings behind what we're reading here. I do remember reading one midrash that talked about had human beings not taken care, not listened and been cursed as a result of all of this, that the snake would have been a very useful animal to human beings. So I don't remember more details about it, but it was just the point that was being made there. And again, one has to wonder about the deeper symbolism involved. Onwards. The Eva Ashit, beincha uvein ha'isha, and enmity will I place between you and between the woman. Uvein zaracha, and between your offspring, your seed, uvein zarah, and between her offspring. David.
Yeah. So before we go on to the next section, I guess my question is, why didn't God just wipe out the snake? The snake is obviously done something very bad. Instead of punishing the snake and leaving the snake around in its, current situation, which everybody fears snakes. I mean, it's it that aside, it's just like, why didn't God just remove the snake and say, okay, you're an evil creature. I don't want to have you anymore. That's it. Bye.
Wonderful question. So I can think of a few answers. One is that who created the snake?
Well, God did, of course, right?
So that means that God would have destroyed something that God actually had created. And the argument of the snake as to the words of the master and the words of this pupil, who does one listen to, was a good argument, and God would have known that argument. God would have realized that argument. In other words, was the snake 100% responsible for what happened? And the answer is no, no. Was the snake seriously guilty of seduction? Yes. But capital punishment for the snake, so to speak, wasn't necessarily a just way in which to deal with this. That's one answer I have. The other answer I have is a very easy answer, which is it's a story. Okay. It's a story.
Well,
and it's trying to maybe deal with a very complex problem that we have, an issue that or a challenge that we have, which has to do, it's so basic and so classic, which is our sexuality. How do we deal with our sexuality? And I think that's behind this story. Go for it, David.
yeah, no, I thanks for both of the explanations. I guess that on the first one, you're right. Understand about God's creating the snake, but then again, you can create something and then realize it's not the right thing, right? It didn't turn out the way you wanted it, and if
True.
it's going to wind up destroying everything else, you remove it, right? You don't necessarily leave it there to create, and also I guess on the intent part, well, that's true that if you look at the whole circumstance of the story, then yes, the snake is not 100% guilty. But as far as the snake itself, it did have evil, it had evil intent, so it basically is an evil creature in that sense, right? So it makes sense. I guess it's just, yeah, it's one of those mysteries. Maybe I'll just treat it as a story and we'll let it go on. It seems, yeah, we'd be much better off if the snake wasn't here, right?
I don't know. I don't know.
Well,
I don't know. Would we be better off if there was no procreation? I don't think so. I mean, that's the mystery and the beauty of reality and life that we have. I want to say one other thing, and it was a piece of wisdom that I learned many, many years ago. Notice how many answers I gave you. I gave you at least two and maybe even three answers.
yep.
And the reason I gave you two or more, let's say more than one answer, is because if the one answer I had given you, or if one of the answers I'd given you was really a good answer, I wouldn't have had to give you any other answers. Okay. So the reason one gives more than one answer is because not one of those answers is really compelling and really satisfactory. And just to realize that. Okay. Yeah.
Well, they're all compelling, but that's thanks for the anecdote. That I mean, or the explanation. That's really good.
I know. I was impressed when I read that myself, how perceptive that was. So, David, I like to make a distinction between a good argument and a compelling argument. A compelling argument means there's nothing you cannot find fault with it.
right.
It is watertight. But there are good arguments. They're good. They just aren't compelling. and I was not able to come up with a compelling argument for you, but hopefully I came up with good ones.
You did come up with good ones. Thank you very much. And thanks for the wisdom there too on arguments. That's great.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a nice one to tuck away when you hear people giving you our reasons.
Yeah,
Okay?
exactly.
Exactly. All right, let's keep going. All right, yes, the next verse. Uh, we mentioned this, right? The Eva ashit beincha uvein haisha. Enmity will I place between you and between the woman, and between her seed and your seed and her seed. Hu yeshuvcha rosh. He will strike you on the head. Va'ata tashufena akev. And you shall strike him by the heel. Again, I think this is really suggestive, um, language here. And I could say, he should strike, if we're talking about the snake as symbolizing the sexual drive, if we understand the snake in that sense, right? Well, so often we realize that what is driving us from the sexuality side or the sexual side is frankly stupid. In other words, that it leads to stupid decisions and decisions that we subsequently regret quite, quite, quite honestly. And that were we to use our rational side, were we to be able to utilize the brain in our body, okay, that we would not do certain things. We would not wind up getting into certain situations, which we got into because at the time we were so tempted to do it, okay? And that could be the reference of you shall strike him on the heel. In other words, right there. And I'm wondering right now, this word akev, heel, where else do we read about heels? We read about it with regard to Jacob. Jacob's name is related to the word heel because he was holding on to Esau's heel when he was born. And that idea is some sort of prevention. In that case of Jacob and Esau, it was understood as Jacob trying to supplant Esau and trying to prevent him from being the firstborn. There are these dynamics that are there. And the fact is, of course, that we are so influenced by our sexual drive that we get caught and smacked by it at times. And this is the reason it's here in chapter 3 is because it's such a basic element of being alive. And how do we deal with it in a way that is safe and which we can not get ourselves into trouble? Because countless people have wound up in terrible situations because they did not allow their heads to govern the other part of their anatomy. And I really believe this is what the story is about underneath, but rather explaining it in the sort of didactic way that I'm explaining it. It's far more, let's say, compelling, right? It's far more interesting. And of course, it lends itself to other interpretations. I'm giving you one interpretation. There may well be other interpretations that are either better or just as good or quite good or whatever. But I really feel at this point that this is what this story is explaining. Anyway, the Eva Ashit, I shall place enmity. Ata lo nikavanta. You, that is the serpent, God is speaking to the serpent, you only intended, your intention was, Sheamut Adam, that Adam would die first, that the man would die first. Kesheyochal hu tchila, that he would die first when he ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Vatisa et Chava, and that you would marry the woman. Again, understanding this as a story and and understanding some symbolism going on here. And we know that, of course, this dynamic does in here in these situations. Velo bata ledaber el Chava tchila. And the only reason that you spoke to Eve first, in other words, if you think about it, if what we're saying here is true, then the question that it's begging is, so why didn't the snake talk to Adam first? If he really wanted Adam to be the one who could eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and die, right? Why didn't he just simply talk to Adam? So the answer is, Ela lefisha nashim datan kalot lehitpatot. And Rashi is saying, and I expect there to be objections to what he's saying here, but because he says women are easily enticed. So, of course, this doesn't sound exactly, it's not that men don't get enticed too. And by the way, we have to keep going. Veyodot lefatot et balehem. And they know how to entice their husbands. So, interesting, right? Okay. Lefichach, and for this reason, ve'eva ashit, and for that reason, I'm going to counter your attempts by putting enmity between you and the woman and her offspring. So, interesting point. Yeshuvcha, right, will strike. Not a common word that needs begging interpretation. Okay. Yechatetcha, that's how you pronounce that, will strike you. The root is katat, right? So that the seed woman and her offspring will strike the snake. Kamo, and he gives an example of other places where this word akot, oto, where it says in the Hebrew, it says, and I beat it up. Okay, this is Moses talking about what he did to the golden calf. The Targumo and the Aramaic translation is the Shafit Yate, and I crushed it. So lakut is also probably to crush is a good translation. So Rashi is showing us that there is a cognate, or rather, I should say that there's that there's a cognate between the Aramaic v'shafit, shafa, and the Hebrew yeshuvcha. So that they're so closely related. V'ata tashufenu akev, and you will strike his heel, right? Lo yahelacha koma, you will have no standing up. That's basically what it means. You will have no height. And that's why we talk about, even in English, we talk about the base desires. And when we try to describe something that is emotional here, because that's what it is essentially, in sort of graphic terms, then we talk about low life, low behavior, base behavior. Teshachenu ba'ikvo, and you will bite him in his heel. V'af mishan, but even there in his heel, tamitenu, you will kill him. You'll be able to kill him. V'lashon teshufenu, and he says this expression teshufenu, kamo nashaf. It's related to a word nashaf, to blow, right? Bahem, on them, to blow on them. And this is from Isaiah chapter 40, and he goes on to say, hanachash ba linshoch, that when the snake comes to bite a person or bite something, hu noshef, it breathes, kamin shrika, it makes a sound like almost a scream or like a whistle or something like that. Ulefisha halashon nofel alashon, and because there's a play on words here, katav lashon nishifa bishnehem, and for this reason it uses the expression of nishifa in both cases. Okay, so it uses the word teshufenu, right, both in the sense of striking, but also that when a snake comes to do that, it makes this sound, this hissing sound that it makes. And this is probably a good place for us to stop for today, and just to give any of you a chance, if you wish to. Let's see, actually, I'm going to go to the next page. We're actually on this page, and we'll go here. And I'll just set the place. And if any of you want to comment, please feel free. I'm going to stop the share. So, okay.
I
Yeah.
think that losing the legs was a pretty big punishment. Just that.
Yes.
Not to mention, we won't like you anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. To lie on his belly, right? To go on
Yeah.
his belly. But I'm sure it's talking more about the symbolism of snakes and not
Yeah.
snakes themselves, etc. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff.
Yep.
So,
It's
all right.
interesting also that King David also fell in that same problem.
Yes. Oh, very.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, very significant. Thank you for mentioning that. Exactly right. He did. And it's very significant because of David's role in our tradition. And just maybe on a somewhat superficial level, I think it's so important that David is not perfect, right?
Oh, yeah.
As important and as great as David is, and he is a great person, nevertheless, his imperfection allows us to understand that it is possible to repent, that it is possible to regret what you've done and to get a fresh start. It may not be a completely fresh start, because it seems to me that after that incident, David really has a lot of problems, right? That there are a lot of, he faces so much adversity up to the end of his, even on his deathbed, he's facing adversity. But he manages. And yeah, there's thank you for mentioning that. I think that's really significant. So I'm going to stop the recording with this. Thank you.